Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The afternoon heat in sagebrush crossing lingered in a dry, unmoving sheet across the ground, and the dust around the trading yard rose in thin spirals each time a wagon wheeled past over hard-packed earth. The place carried its usual noise: men haggling over cattle, merchants shouting prices, horses shifting restlessly at the rails. But beneath everything was a sour tension Harlan Boone noticed the moment he stepped down from his horse. He pulled his coat straight, adjusted the strap of his saddlebag, and scanned the yard the way he'd learned during years of escorting supply caravans and working long cattle drives. He didn't trust crowded spaces anymore, not since he lost his younger brother in a raid 10 years earlier, and the memory of that night still made him cautious whenever men gathered too closely. Harlan had come to town for practical reasons only. He needed new hinges for the barn door, a sack of salt, a tool handle to replace the one he cracked last week, and enough flour to last through the coming month. His homestead lay far from the main trail, built against the dry canyon wall where few people traveled, and he liked it that way. Solitude kept things predictable. No one asked questions. No one tried to pry into the years he spent drifting after the raid that took the boy he raised like a son. He walked toward the trading post with slow, deliberate steps, but an unusual crowd near the far end of the yard caught his eye. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, some leaning over the rail, others pushing forward for a better look. Their voices didn't match the usual bargaining tone. Instead, there were short bursts of laughter, sharp calls, and the sound of a wooden stick striking against the platform. Harlan's stomach knotted. He recognized the rhythm of something he had seen before on the trail, something involving people who couldn't defend themselves. He angled his steps toward the commotion, his boots scraping lightly through loose dirt. With each stride, his breath tightened a little more. He wanted to believe it was just another livestock trade, but the longer he listened, the harder it became to ignore a sense of dread building in his chest. His heartbeat thudded in a steady, controlled rhythm, the same way it did before gunfire broke out on long escort rides. When he reached the platform, he stopped so abruptly that a man behind him muttered under his breath. 3 Apache girls stood on the boards with their wrists tied by thin rope. The restraint looked lazy, as if the men who captured them hadn't bothered to secure it because they expected the girls to be too exhausted to resist. The oldest held herself upright despite shaking arms. Her long black hair hung in stiff, tangled strands that pointed to days of rough travel. The middle girl stayed pressed to her side, breathing in short, unsteady pulls as she watched the men below. The youngest hid behind both of them, her thin shoulders jerking each time someone in the crowd shouted. A man wearing a red scarf tapped the rail again with a stick. 3 workers, he called out, taken from a camp east of the ridge. Good for chores. Strong enough if you know how to handle them. Harlan felt something shift inside him with painful clarity. He had seen enough raids in his life to know what these girls had gone through before arriving here. His mind flicked to the image of his brother, lying on the ground, breath slowing, chest torn open, and the helplessness that had swallowed him as he tried to stop the bleeding. He had carried that moment for a decade, and facing these 3 frightened girls brought the old guilt back with startling force. He noticed details no one else seemed to care about. The oldest girl's stance was defensive, not submissive. She kept her chin lifted even though her voice trembled when she whispered something to the girl beside her. The middle one blinked rapidly, a sign of someone trying not to panic in front of strangers. The youngest's bare feet were scraped along the tops, showing she had been pushed or dragged at some point. Harlan swallowed hard. He felt anger rising, not loud or explosive, but steady and cold. His breath grew shallower, and he clenched his jaw to keep himself steady. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to start trouble he couldn't finish. But he also couldn't walk away. The thought of leaving them there made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt since the night he buried his brother. The scarf man shouted the first price. Before anyone else spoke, Harlan stepped forward. "I'll pay it," he said in a quiet, controlled tone. No hesitation, no bargaining. He reached into his coat and pulled out the money he'd been saving for winter repairs. His hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from a burst of adrenaline he kept carefully contained. The scarfed man stared at him. For all three. Yes. Cash. Harlan placed the bills into the man's palm without counting. He didn't care about the amount anymore. He just wanted the noise around the girls to stop. The man flipped through the stack, satisfied, and shoved the rope toward him. Harlan didn't touch it. Instead, he drew his knife, cut the rope cleanly, and let it drop to the floorboards. The sudden stillness in the crowd washed over them like a brief pause before a storm. Men murmured, some irritated, others surprised at how quickly the sale had ended. Harlan ignored them all. He turned to the girls, speaking evenly so they could hear the meaning in his words, even if they didn't catch every syllable. "You're coming with me. You're safe now." The oldest stared at him, studying his face the same way she would study a threat. She looked for something hidden, something dangerous, something familiar to the men who had dragged her here. She found nothing but a tired man holding steady under his own weight. The middle girl clung to her arm. The youngest blinked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Harlan didn't touch any of them. He simply walked toward the wagon he had left near the trough, making sure his pace was slow enough that they could choose to follow or refuse. They followed. The oldest climbed onto the wagon first. The middle girl lifted the youngest by the elbow to help her up. Harlan took the driver's seat, gathered the reins, and kept his voice low when he spoke to the horse, giving the girls time to settle before the wagon began to move. The wheels rattled across the yard. No one stopped them. No one tried to reclaim the girls. The auction noise faded behind them, replaced by the steady creak of wood and the soft sound of wind brushing across their path. Harlan didn't look back at the trading post. He didn't need to. Something inside him had already shifted. What started as a supply trip had turned into a responsibility he hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. 3 girls sat behind him, frightened, exhausted, and waiting to see what kind of man he really was. As the wagon rolled toward the open plains and the long road home, Harlan Boone knew only one thing with absolute certainty. Returning to his quiet life alone was no longer possible. The decision had been made the moment he saw their faces. A new chapter of his life had begun, and turning back wasn't an option. The sky had shifted to a pale orange by the time Harlan Boone guided the wagon off the main trail and toward the narrow path leading to his land. The air cooled quickly with every mile they moved away from town, and the girls sat close together in the back, their shoulders pressed tightly as if any space between them felt unsafe. None of them spoke. None of them tried to climb down. They watched the changing landscape with guarded attention, unsure whether they were being taken somewhere safe or simply to another place of uncertainty. Harlan kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the reins. He could feel their fear without looking, and the weight of it pressed against him in a way he hadn't expected. His original mission for the day, buy supplies and return home, had shifted into something far more complicated. He hadn't planned for visitors. He hadn't prepared a room. He hadn't used the spare cot in years. But he also knew there was no turning them away now. A faint breeze carried the dry smell of sage as they reached the ridge above his homestead. From there, the land stretched wide in every direction. A small corral with 2 horses grazing, a smokehouse built from salvaged lumber, and a one-room cabin set against the gentle slope of a canyon wall. The property looked modest and worn, but it was quiet, and quiet meant safety. Harlan pulled the wagon to a stop near the porch and glanced back at the girls. Their expressions tensed even more now that they faced an unknown place. The oldest girl studied the cabin with sharp, calculating eyes. The middle one scanned every corner of the yard as though expecting someone to jump out of hiding. The youngest stared at the ground, her hands gripping the side rail of the wagon. "You can get down," Harlan said, keeping his tone steady and controlled. The oldest girl moved first. She dropped lightly to the ground, landing with practiced caution. The middle followed, staying close enough that their arms brushed. The youngest hesitated, then climbed down slowly, her legs shaking from exhaustion and nerves. Harlan stepped aside as they approached the porch. He unlocked the cabin door and stood back so they could enter without feeling cornered. The girls exchanged uncertain glances before stepping inside one at a time. The interior smelled of wood smoke and dry cedar. A small stove sat near the corner with a stack of chopped logs beside it. The bed was neatly made, though clearly used often. A table with 2 chairs stood under the only window, and the spare room, more of a storage space, held a folded cot, tools, and a few crates of dried goods. The girls paused just past the doorway. They didn't touch anything. They didn't move farther than necessary. They stayed, bunched together, waiting for his next action with stiff posture. Harlan cleared his throat once, feeling oddly self-conscious in his own home. "You can stay in there," he said, nodding toward the spare room. "Door doesn't lock. Use it how you want." The oldest girl's eyes flicked toward the shed outside, as if checking his intentions. He caught the meaning. "I'll sleep out there tonight," he added. "Gives you space." A subtle shift crossed their faces, small, almost unnoticeable changes in their posture that showed a sliver of relief, or at least less fear. The youngest stepped toward the stove, drawn to the warmth. Her fingers hovered a moment over the metal door before she pulled back, unsure if she was allowed to use it. "You can sit," Harlan said quietly. "You can rest." She lowered herself onto the edge of the table bench without looking up. Asha, the oldest, finally spoke, her voice steady but tight. "Why help us?" Harlan met her gaze. He didn't look away. "Because leaving you, there wasn't something I could do." She held his stare, searching for lies. She didn't find any, but she didn't relax either. Trust wasn't something she could offer after what she'd endured. Talina, the middle girl, stepped in front of her younger sister as if shielding her from something unseen. The instinct told Harlan more about their past than any words could. He didn't push further. He didn't ask questions. Instead, he walked to the shelf, took down a blanket, and placed it folded on the table. "There's more in the storage room. Take what you need." He stepped back out onto the porch, shutting the door quietly behind him to give them privacy. Outside, the evening air grew colder. Harlan stood beside the porch rail, listening to the faint sounds inside the cabin. The shuffle of feet, the creak of the cot unfolding, the soft